For those joining the webinar, just wait a few minutes. We should be starting soon.
Okay, people, get some food and then you can come. You know, front rows are always open and welcoming for you. Okay? Your professors are up in front. I'm looking at Dr. Zheznik now coming up front. Right, exactly. So are we ready to start? Everybody got cookies? Yes? So I think we're good, yes. So welcome everybody. It's a beautiful day today, and really it makes our celebration more special, right? To celebrate Bishop Bayley, who actually was the founder of this university. If it wasn't for him actually, and his conversion to Catholicism, his baptism that happened like tomorrow, 180 years ago, right? So we missed it by one day. It would have been, you know, Seton Hall University, and also he was the first bishop of Newark, right? Did you guys hear about this story in the core when you took the core? Maybe core 1 or core 2? Mother Seton, the connection with Bishop Bayley? How many of you have heard about that? Come on. No one? Okay, you are here. You're going to learn, and that's the purpose, right? So Bishop Bayley's actual life and trajectory and conversion, you know, to Catholicism, it's a fascinating piece of theology, but also of history. And I'll tell you a side story. I just came from Italy, actually, teaching a course on the foundations of Christian culture. And I brought students, Seton Hall students, obviously, to Sicily. So we went south, and then we went to Rome. And guess what? One of the places that we visited in Rome is the church, the church where Bishop Bayley received the sacrament of baptism. And it's how it, you know, the history came alive is the church. And I'm sure that Msgr Kupke is going to talk about his, baptism in that particular church. It is a Jesuit church. Jesuit meaning, you know, it is the Society of Jesus, the Jesuits, right? That run that church. And Bishop Bayley went there, just, you know, very near the church. He, attended the spiritual exercises of Saint Ignatius of Loyola. And then what happened next? He decided to convert to the Catholic faith. He was an Episcopalian minister, actually. So he was very knowledgeable in the faith. So he made that conversion, if you will, although, you know, it's the same faith, right? Being very, very knowledgeable about that. So it's a fascinating piece of history. And whenever I at least go to Rome with my students or to Italy, you always have that, you know, Seton Hall connections. One time we went to Livorno, where you know who Mother Seton is, right? You have seen the stage here, right? Mother Seton stayed there in the house where she stayed, when she converted, and it's really, you know, makes a lot of difference, I can say, right? So our university is very much connected, you know, to Rome. Now I'm going to invite my dear colleague and friend, Father Jerry Bonapane, that if you guys haven't taken yet a course by Father Bonapane, I would strongly suggest that you take one course. It's a core 3 course and a Catholic Studies course that is called, are you ready to hear this? Theology of Food. It's one of the best courses, you know, that we offer here at Catholic Studies and core 3. And Father Jerry is going to introduce our very distinguished speaker, Father Jerry.
Thank you, Dr. Mirzaku, for that introduction of me. Yeah, there is a theology of food, even in these chocolate chip cookies. So if you can get into the course, that'd be great. My friends, during our wonderful week here at Seton Hall of the Peter Scheim Academic Expo, it's so wonderful to see such a great attendance for a wonderful event, and certainly a most wonderful speaker that we have today. Msgr Raymond Kupke. I'm what they call a late vocation, ordained a priest not that many years ago, and just in 2006. And I was a student of Msgr Kupke's here in the seminary in his church history classes. And, you know, he's a wonderful teacher. As a historian, he really puts you into that time as he talks about it with great, certainly expertise, but his great wit and great sense of humor. So I know I look fondly back at those days in the classroom with him. He's certainly a wonderful pastoral presence in our church. But so Msgr Kupke will address certainly this beautiful conversion story of Bishop Bayley. I think maybe as Dr. Mirzaku mentioned, actually tomorrow, April 28th, is the 180th anniversary of that conversion to Catholicism. But Msgr Kupke is an adjunct professor of church history here at Immaculate Conception Seminary School of Theology. He is a priest of the Paterson, New Jersey diocese. He's ordained a priest in 1973, and it was in 1998 that Monsignor was raised to that level of Monsignor, Prelate of Honor, by Pope John Paul II in 1998. Monsignor studied here at Seton Hall with a bachelor's degree and an MDiv, and then went on for an MA and a PhD at Catholic University of America. He studied, after so much of that study, he did study archival studies at NYU. And since 1976, Monsignor has served as the archivist in the Diocese of Paterson. So he's written many articles and books about American church history, certainly about New Jersey Catholic history, as he writes for the newspaper in Paterson, the Beacon newspaper. So I could certainly say more, but I don't want to hold back from inviting Monsignor come up and to give his lecture. Monsignor Kupke, thank you very much for being here today. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I am shocked that there are this many of you here. I was expecting to give this talk for maybe 4 people. I had no idea there was this much interest in Archbishop Bayley. I want to thank Dr. Mazurko and Father Jerry also. When I taught Jerry 15, 16 years ago, his class was the wildest class I ever taught in the seminary. I still have battle scars from his class. They're quite an interesting cast of characters. They're all, of course, now pastors and movers and shakers in the diocese, so it's fun to see them do so well. My real claim to fame in terms of Seton Hall is not as an adjunct professor, but the fact that Seton Hall's official ghostwriter, Joe McLaughlin, was my altar boy once upon a time. So it's good to see him again as well. Just 2 details that Agnes brought up. How many of you know where the Jets property is up in Florham Park, the Jets practice dome? Oh, yes. If you can think of that property and go across the street from there, that is the original Seton Hall property. That's where the college and the university started 160 years ago. And they thought it was too remote. It was too far away to attract students. So after 4 years, they sold the property, and Archbishop Bayley literally saw the place that we're sitting on right now. He was coming home from a church confirmation, and he was driving his buggy up what was now South Orange Avenue, and he saw this piece of property with a house on it where President's Hall is and nothing else. And he said, "Do you think they would sell us this piece of property?" And he literally went and knocked on the door and asked if it was available. And the rest is history. That's why we're here today. So he has a very, very important role in Seton Hall. But I'm happy today to join with the whole Seton Hall community in remembering this important milestone in the life of our founder, Archbishop James Roosevelt Bayley. 100 years ago, 180 years ago tomorrow, which was also a Thursday that year, 27-year-old Father James Roosevelt Bayley, after a general confession of his sins that stretched out over 2 days, received conditional Catholic baptism from an Irish Jesuit priest, Father Bartholomew Esmond. And later, in the Baroque splendor of the St. Ignatius Chapel in the Church of the Gesù in Rome, he was confirmed and admitted to First Holy Communion by the prefect of the Congregation de Propaganda Fide, Cardinal Giacomo Franzoni. As head of the church's mission office in Rome, Franzoni was something of a point man with regard to interesting ecclesiastics from the English-speaking world. 6 years later, he would be the one that would ordain John Henry Newman to the priesthood, and thus began an adventure that would impact all of our lives and bring us to this room today. Bayley was born in Manhattan on August 23rd, 1814, the son of Guy Carlton Bayley, a prominent city physician, and Grace Roosevelt. His paternal grandfather, also a physician, was the first chief medical officer of the city of New York. If any of you saw on TV in the past months the COVID-19 commercials of Dr. Dave Chokshi, the chief health officer of the city of New York, James Roosevelt Bayley's grandfather was his original predecessor in the 18th century, and he actually is the one who designed New York City's very first quarantine against a cholera epidemic. His father's half-sister, Elizabeth Ann Seton, was the first native of the United States to be canonized a saint. On his mother's side, Bayley was related to both the future American President Roosevelts. His mother's father, James Roosevelt, is also the great-grandfather of President Franklin Roosevelt. His relation to Theodore Roosevelt is a little bit more distant. Bayley was baptized into the Episcopal faith at Trinity Church in Manhattan, down on Wall Street, on September 21st, 1814. He and his siblings were raised first at Mamaroneck, and later, after his mother died when he was 13, closer to the city. He was educated in a number of schools, including Amherst and the future Trinity College at Hartford. His career plans shifted several times. At first, he contemplated leaving school and joining the Navy. Later, at Hartford, like his grandfather and father, he began medical studies. But after only a year as a medical student, he switched to theology with an intent to enter the Episcopal ministry. Bayley studied at Middletown, Connecticut, under the Reverend Samuel Jarvis, a noted Episcopal cleric of the day and the first historiographer of the Episcopal Church, and the possessor of a 10,000 volume library. It is during these years, while immersing himself in the study of the fathers of the church under Jarvis's direction, that the first seeds of doubt that led to Bayley's conversion began to appear. To the extent that Jarvis recognized the theological doubts that Bayley was experiencing, the force of the older cleric's influence and experience were able to keep Bayley on the straight and narrow, at least for a time. At the same time, his family's connections were also pushing him forward. His father had moved the family to Harlem, where he was now a vestryman at St. Andrew's Episcopal Church. When the rector of St. Andrew's had to take a medical leave of absence, Bayley was named to administer the parish and was ordained an Episcopal deacon on October 3rd, 1839. The following summer, he filled in again, this time in upstate New York at Avon near Rochester. Finally, the vacancy at St. Andrews became permanent, and Bayley accepted the call to the rectorship of St. Andrews on October 19, 1840. Bishop John Onderdonk of New York ordained Bayley an Episcopal priest at St. Andrews on February 14, 1841. But neither the excitement of pastoral duties, nor the example of Jarvis, nor his own family's influence could calm Bayley's hesitations. After only a year as rector of St. Andrews, less than a year actually, he resigned the rectorship of the church and literally and religiously began sailing up the Tiber to Rome. There are at least 5 major factors which played into Bayley's decision to enter the Catholic Church 180 years ago tomorrow. First of all, in this period, there was, for want of a better word, a strong whiff of Romanism that was rampant in the English-speaking world. In England itself, the Oxford movement, which would produce John Henry Newman, among many others, was in full swing. While there were very specific theological, ecclesial, liturgical, and even political issues which made the Oxford movement uniquely English, there could not help but be an awareness on this side of the pond of some of the struggles that were going on and some of the tensions that were being developed. While Bayley was in Rome later, for example, 3 Oxford movement ecclesiastics founded in Wisconsin the Shoda House Seminary, which still exists today, as a way of providing clergy that were trained in the high church movement of Episcopalianism. Even today, the Shoda House is considered the most conservative of the Episcopal seminaries in the United States and is used not only by the Episcopalians, but also by the Anglo-Catholic communion. At the same time, by the time Bayley becomes Bishop of Newark, he is one of 3 American Catholic bishops who were once Episcopalian priests. And in the same time, the Episcopal Bishop of North Carolina, Samuel Ives, resigns his position and becomes a Catholic. And that does not include some of the late prominent converts, such as Father Isaac Hecker, who later founded the Paulists, and Orestes Brownson, who has connections to Seton Hall. Secondly, at Middletown with Dr. Jarvis, Bayley got a solid grounding in the fathers of the church. In particular, Bayley read deeply in Jerome and Irenaeus, who was just named the doctor of the church 2 months ago, and also in the decrees of the early church councils. This reading raised many questions about the universality of the church, the very Catholic nature of the church, versus the via media approach of Anglicanism. The role of the papacy also seemed to Bayley, in his reading, to be more present and more prominent in the early church than Episcopalianism was willing to concede. Thirdly, during this brief time in Harlem at St. Andrews, which was only a matter of months when all is said and done, Bayley was able to come into contact, possibly for the first time in his career, with Roman Catholic clergy. In particular, he met regularly with Father Michael Curran, the pastor of St. Paul's Church in Harlem, and even more crucially, with Father John McCluskey, who was both the pastor of St. Joseph's in Greenwich Village and also the first president of St. John's College in New York, the precursor of the modern Fordham University. McCluskey, who would later become Archbishop of New York himself, in particular, spent a great deal of time answering Bayley's questions and demonstrating to him a Catholic understanding of some of the issues he was wrestling with. Years later, while at Newark, Bayley would serve in a similar capacity for another Episcopal deacon, George Hobart Doane, the son of the Episcopal Bishop of New Jersey, who also made the jump to Rome and served as Bayley's Vicar General in Newark. Bayley would get to thank McCluskey for his kindness more than 30 years later, when Bayley, as Archbishop of Baltimore, would preside in the name of Pope Pius IX over the ceremonies in Old St. Patrick's Cathedral in New York, imposing the red hat on McCluskey as the first American cardinal. It was McCluskey in particular who helped Bayley cope when the hesitations became almost paralyzing during his final months at St. Andrews. Fourthly, the example of the Catholics in Bayley's family, particularly his aunt, St. Elizabeth Ann Bayley Seton, cannot be discounted. Bayley was in regular communication with his Catholic cousins, and their experience helped to make real what must at sometimes seemed almost surreal to Bayley. On his voyage to Europe, Bayley went out of his way to visit Livorno and the Felici family, whose lives, whose practical Catholicism had helped usher his aunt into the Catholic Church decades earlier. He visited the house where the Setons had stayed and gave the grave of his aunt's husband a visit as well. In later years, Bayley attributed much of his conversion to the intercession of his sainted aunt. And in death, unlike almost all the other archbishops of Baltimore, Bayley chose not to be buried in the crypt of the Cathedral Basilica of the Assumption in Baltimore, but rather at Msgr, next to his sainted aunt in the Mother House Cemetery. Finally, the last factor in Bayley's conversion was physically going to Rome. Bayley's grandfather, James Roosevelt, was so unnerved by the leanings that his grandson was having towards Catholicism that in what admittedly must have been an unwitting Hail Mary play, Roosevelt arranged to send the young man to Europe. What was he thinking about? Where was this grandfather when I was young? Everybody should have a grandfather like James Roosevelt. Apparently, the older Roosevelt was convinced that a good dose of exposure to Romanism, to the corruption, the foppery, the degeneration of Rome, the superstition of Catholicism, and the obvious fallacies of the papacy Once his grandson got to see this up close and personal, surely it would set his grandson and his namesake on the straight and narrow and show him in detail the error of his ways. Right. Roosevelt must have been unaware of the religious results the last time the other side of the family had visited Italy. The Romans have a special word, Romanità, to describe the peculiar kind of beguilement that their city casts on anybody who visits it. Bayley hardly stood a chance. He arrived in Rome on February 24th, 180 years ago. He had letters of introduction from Father McCluskey to Father Paul Cullen, the rector of the Irish College in Rome, and later himself Cardinal Archbishop of Dublin, and Dr. Baggs, the rector of the Venerable English College. Easter was early that year, falling on March 27th. So Bayley experienced the end of Lent and Holy Week in Rome itself, with all the spiritual energy and power those celebrations can convey. Dr. Baggs introduced Bayley to another convert, George Haskins, a former Episcopal priest from Boston, who had himself converted to Catholicism 2 years earlier. They became lifelong friends. And in the course of long walks and conversations with Haskins, Bayley went over his misgivings and his doubts about conversion. Haskins suggested that Bayley make a retreat and humbly and sincerely ask for the help of the Holy Spirit. Haskins made the arrangements for Bayley to make an Ignatian retreat under the Irish Jesuit Bartholomew Esmond at the residence next to the Gesù, where St. Ignatius of Loyola himself had lived in Rome. Bayley began the retreat 180 years ago last Tuesday. And by the end of the week, he was received into the Catholic Church. After his conversion and sending letters home to tell his relatives, the Catholic branch of the family were delighted. His grandfather promptly wrote him out of the will, as did his uncle as well. Bayley would later try and claim in court his grants back, but it didn't completely work. And part of the foundation of the Episcopal Seminary in Manhattan comes from what should have been Bayley's grant from his uncle Roosevelt. Bayley spent a couple of months traveling around Europe on his own grand tour in the fashion of the day. And finally, he entered the seminary of Saint-Sulpice in Paris in August 1842. 92 years later, his 20th century successor, Archbishop Peter Garrity, would enter the same seminary in Paris himself in 1934. That same month, Bayley met his bishop for the first time, Bishop John J. Hughes of New York, when Hughes was visiting Paris on his way to Rome. It was Hughes' suggestion that Bayley complete his studies in New York at St. John's College. After a year in Paris, Bayley arrived in New York on August 1843. There, things progressed very quickly. And during the Lenten Ember Days of 1844, Bayley would be advanced through all the minor and major orders in a week and ordained a Catholic priest by Hughes in Old St. Patrick's Cathedral on Mott Street on March 2nd, 1844. A week later, in the same cathedral, Bayley was present for the Episcopal ordination of his friend, John McCluskey, as coadjutor bishop of New York. At that time, the New York diocese covered the whole state of New York and the northern half of New Jersey as well. It did not have a very deep clerical bench. Bayley, with his Manhattan connections, his family connections and experience, as well as his Roman and Parisian experience, was a varsity player right from day one. Hughes immediately named him vice president of St. John's College, even as the president was on a leave of absence in Europe. While at St. John's in 1845, Bayley was finally able to visit for the first time Emmitsburg, Maryland. It was an emotional visit, as he was able to speak with the few surviving members of the community who remembered his saint's aunt and who had lived and worked with her. In less than 2 years at St. John's, Bayley was able to accomplish two of Bishop Hughes's long-term goals for St. John's. First of all, he secured a charter from the state of New York. And then, after 2 refusals, he succeeded in convincing the Jesuits to take over the college from the diocese. With the arrival of the Jesuits in July 1846, Bayley was done with St. John's and was made pastor of St. Peter's Church at New Brighton on Staten Island. But this assignment was very short-lived. 5 months later, Hughes tapped Bayley to be his personal secretary. Over the next 7 years, the New York diocese would experience tremendous growth. It would be divided for the first time with 2 new dioceses at Albany and Buffalo. Bayley's friend John McCluskey would become the first bishop of Albany. New York would be raised to an archdiocese itself and experience all kinds of upheaval and turmoil. Being the secretary to a bishop whose nickname in ecclesiastical circles was Dagger John was not always an easy experience. Bayley and Hughes were cut from 2 very different bolts of cloth, but they made it work, and they complemented each other exceptionally well. And in the process, Bayley acquired a lot of experience and seasoning. In May 1852, Bayley accompanied Hughes to the first plenary council of Baltimore. Among the many things discussed were provisions for the continued expansion of the American church. The council recommended to Rome that several new dioceses be erected across the country to deal with this growth. This included recommendations for places like San Francisco, California, and Santa Fe in New Mexico territory. Despite the fact that New York had just been divided 3 years earlier, the conciliar fathers recommended still another double division of New York. On the 7th of July, 1853, Rome reacted with the announcement of the creation of 10 new dioceses in the United States across the country, including Brooklyn, New York, and Newark, New Jersey. Archbishop Hughes lost not only territory, but also manpower. His Vicar General, John Laughlin, was named first Bishop of Brooklyn, and his secretary, James Bayley, was named the first Bishop of Newark. On October 30th, 1853, in the grandest Catholic ceremony ever experienced in the new republic, Bayley participated in the first triple episcopal ordination of bishops in the United States. Archbishop Gaetano Bedini, the visiting apostolic nuncio to Brazil, presided at the ordination of John Laughlin as first Bishop of Brooklyn, Louis de Gosbriand, the Vicar General of Cleveland, as the first Bishop of Burlington, Vermont, and James Roosevelt Bayley as the first Bishop of Newark. It had been just 9 years since Bayley's ordination as a priest in the same church. 2 days later, on All Saints' Day, Bayley took an early morning boat ride across the Hudson to what is now called Jersey City, where he boarded a train which deposited him in Newark around 10 o'clock in the morning. Thousands of people greeted him at the Center Street Depot in downtown Newark. A procession more than a mile long of clergy, school children, religious societies, and 3 brass bands escorted him to his new home on Washington Street next to the newly designated St. Patrick's Cathedral. The clergy vested and moved to the cathedral, where Bayley was solemnly installed as first Bishop of Newark. The pastor of St. Patrick's, the veteran French missionary Louis-Dominique Senez, the very moment he discovered that his church had been named the cathedral of the new diocese, immediately made his way across the Hudson to New York and submitted his resignation to Bayley. He wanted nothing to do with being rector of the cathedral. So, as bishop-elect, Bayley appointed a young priest, Bernard McQuaid, the pastor of St. Vincent's in Madison, as the new rector of the cathedral. McQuaid, whom, as we all know from this campus, would be called upon Bayley for a number of future endeavors, demonstrated his ability to the new bishop by organizing all these festivities in less than 2 weeks. Perhaps the measure of McQuaid's organizing talents can be surmised from the printed marching orders that he gave to those in the procession. Quote, "It will be the duty of every Catholic, either in the procession or on the ground, by his orderly and religious demeanor, to do honor to the bishop, to reflect credit on the Catholic body of Newark, even at the sacrifice of his own personal gratification." In other words, no screaming, no yelling, no signs, do it nice. McQuaid sold his own horse and buggy in order to pay for the banquet he provided afterwards for the 50 clergy who were present. The group must have been an amazement to the local press, since there were only 30 priests in New Jersey at a total. Once the fireworks died down, Bayley sized up what he had been entrusted with. The new see joined in one diocese 2 parts of New Jersey, which since 1808 had been divided under 2 dioceses, New York and Philadelphia. There were about 40,000 Catholics in the state, with 33 churches served by just 30 priests. Camden, Metuchen, and Passaic, all of which today have their own bishop, did not yet have a priest at this point. 7 of the state's counties, Bergen, Camden, Cumberland, Monmouth, Ocean, Sussex, and Warren, did not yet have a Catholic church. There were only a handful of religious sisters present in the state, mostly working in orphanages. All of them were members of the New York Sisters of Charity, a diocesan community. And since New Jersey was no longer part of the New York Diocese, Archbishop Hughes withdrew all nuns back to New York in one shot and left New Jersey with nobody. There were a lot of challenges for Bayley. But I think it is safe to say that Bayley's nearly 19 years in New Jersey were the happiest years of his life. Bayley immediately began with a visitation of the whole state by train and buggy, beginning with St. Mary's Parish in Salem. St. Mary's today can be accessed by exit 2 on the New Jersey Turnpike. If you've ever gotten off on exit 2, there's nothing there. And imagine getting back up to Newark by buggy and train from exit 2 on the turnpike. It was a several-week operation making his way back north. He was very much a missionary bishop and had no problem making do with primitive circumstances. On a 4-day visit to Sussex County in 1868, he confirmed 33 people in a room over a general store in Stanhope. Then, the next day, Sunday, he went to Hackettstown, confirmed another 41 at the new St. Mary's Church. By Monday, he traveled by buggy 16 miles to Newton, gave a lecture, confirmed 29 more people. And then finally, the next morning on Monday, he got to Franklin, confirmed 24, and got back to Newton in time to make the 10 o'clock train back to Newark. He was a young bishop at this point, only 54. On another visit to Sussex County, he celebrated confirmation in a blacksmith shop in what is today Vernon Township. For a variety of pastoral and personal reasons, he often found himself heading from South Orange, where he lived, up to the Madison area. And in a journal entry on December 5th, 1854, going over the mountain on what is now South Orange Avenue, he commented on the very fine sleighing that night on the road going over. He liked New Jersey. He enjoyed being Bishop of Newark. But New Jersey also enjoyed Bayley. And the New Jersey Catholic Church benefited greatly from his ministrations. His legacy in New Jersey can be seen in several crucial areas of New Jersey Catholic life that date back to him. First, during his time, the 33 churches he found in 1853 grew to 113 churches by the time he left in 1872, including 9 in Newark, 7 in Jersey City, and 3 in Trenton. The 80 new churches that he founded, including St. Francis in Lodi, the very first Catholic church in Bergen County, St. Joseph's in Sussex and Newton, first Catholic church in that county, and St. Francis in Metuchen and Immaculate Conception in Camden, both now the cathedral churches of those 2 dioceses. If the number of churches soared, even more so did the number of schools. The 1,500 students he found in Catholic school in 1853 grew to 20,000 by the time he left 19 years later. In order to provide teachers for these schools, Bayley happily welcomed several new religious orders of women into the diocese, including Benedictines, Franciscans, Dominicans, and the School Sisters of Notre Dame. But one of Bayley's major legacies was the establishment of a diocesan congregation of women to help replace the New York Charities. By 1858, Bayley had personally identified 5 young women in New Jersey who were willing to join a religious congregation of nuns in New Jersey if he could get it started. So he got the 5 together, shipped them off to Cincinnati, where his aunt's last pupil was the Superior General of the Cincinnati Charities. They agreed to put them through the novitiate and train them as religious. Meanwhile, Bayley went back to his old friend in New York, Archbishop Hughes, asked for the loan of 2 nuns on a 3-year basis to help provide leadership for these 5 women that were out in Cincinnati. And finally, after a year, he got the 7 of them together, and that's the origin of the Sisters of Charity of St. Elizabeth, headquartered first in Newark, downtown, and then later at Convent Station. The new community grew very rapidly. The 2 loner nuns never went back to New York. Mother Xavier provided stable leadership for the group for over half a century. By the time Bayley left for Baltimore, the congregation numbered 170 nuns. If the need for religious sisters was great, the need for priests was even greater. During his Newark years, Bayley welcomed Benedictines, Passionists, Carmelites, Franciscans, and Franciscan conventuals to work in the new diocese. But he was even more concerned about growing a well-formed diocesan clergy. That led, of course, to our most obvious common denominator and connection to Bayley, and arguably his most important legacy to Catholic New Jersey, the institution that he modestly named after his sainted aunt, Seton Hall. Long on vision, but short on cash, Bayley nevertheless extended himself and purchased Madame Chegaret's Academy in Madison on Park Avenue. The building is still standing today. Every good Seton Hall student should make a trip out to Madison at least once and look at the original Seton Hall and see how far we've come. That building, still standing, shares a legacy with Nassau Hall in Princeton and Queens College at Rutgers as one of the oldest educational buildings still standing and still in use in the state of New Jersey. In that modest building, 5 of the premier Catholic institutions in New Jersey, Seton Hall Prep, Seton Hall University, Immaculate Conception Seminary, the Academy of St. Elizabeth, and St. Elizabeth's University can all trace themselves back to that building. And all of them can also trace themselves back to James Roosevelt Bayley. All 5 are part of the legacy that Bayley left to Catholic New Jersey, since each of their founding can be traced back to him. Not a bad legacy for one man. With Seton Hall, of course, there's an even greater connection. Always anxious for the future of his new college, he started out with 5 students in the fall of 1856 at Madison. And the failure to attract very many new students to Madison made him anxious about its rural location. Would that they just held the course and we would own that property today, but that's another story. He sought to move Seton Hall from Madison back closer to the city. So while on a carriage ride one day to Newark, Bayley himself spotted this property where we now sit. He inquired about its availability, and again, with money that he really didn't have, he made an offer and bought the place. And the rest, as they say, is history, our history. Part of Bayley's intense interest in Seton Hall rested in what we now call the Seminary School of Theology. He saw Seton Hall as an institution that would help him grow a well-formed diocesan clergy. But his interests in that area were not restricted only to Seton Hall and Immaculate Conception Seminary. When in 1859, Pope Pius IX appealed to the American bishops to help him establish an American seminary at Rome, Bayley could easily have begged off. He had his own financial problems, his own manpower problems, and his own little seminary to try and start. But perhaps remembering his own time in Rome, Bayley sent a donation of $3,263 to found the new Pontifical North American College. Not an inconsiderable amount at the time. But even more, he sent one of his seminarians, Michael Augustine Corrigan, to become a member of the very first class at Rome. And a number of years later, Corrigan becomes Bayley's successor as the 2nd Bishop of Newark and the first North American College alumnus to be named a bishop. The Bayley legacy at Rome is amply testified to by the continuing line of Roman-trained priests that have served the Newark Archdiocese, many of whom live and work on this campus even today. There is one more, perhaps quieter aspect of Bayley's legacy of a century and a half ago that many people might be unaware of, but which has come into play big time just in the past few years. There is a small dedicated group that praise Bayley's name just about every night of their lives based on this part of his legacy. As soon as he could, Bayley gathered his clergy on retreat at the old Seton Hall, followed by the first diocesan synod in 1856 and a second synod in 1868. These helped draft regulations for the structure and administration of the diocese. But one of Bayley's real concerns was church property. He spent a good deal of his early years as bishop slowly wresting away from pastors, trustees, and congregations the deeds to the property of the churches in New Jersey and having them transferred to himself. This followed Catholic procedure, where the bishop, as the ordinary or the focal point of the diocese, is really the point man of the local church, not the local parish. But one day, it suddenly occurred to Bayley that holding all this property in his own name might not be such a good idea. It suddenly occurred to him that if he were to die suddenly, there might be questions over his estate. And would his Protestant relatives in New York that still weren't really reconciled to him being a Catholic, would they suddenly inherit all the Catholic churches in New Jersey as a result of his owning the property? So he worked with friends in the New Jersey state legislature, and he got the legislature to enact on February 17th, 1864, an amendment to an existing law regarding religious corporations in New Jersey. This amendment provided for a unique Catholic form of civil incorporation for all the Catholic parishes in the state. In this format, every Catholic parish in New Jersey is a separate five-man civil corporation with the bishop as president, the vicar general as vice president, the local pastor as secretary treasurer, and two members of the congregation as trustees. This format allowed Bayley to preserve the authority of the bishop over church property, since he can appoint and remove all the other officers of the corporation. But at the same time, it separated the parish property not only from the personal property of the bishop, but also from all the other parishes as well. Even today, if you ever do property research in the Hall of Records of any of the 21 county seats of New Jersey, and go into the register, the index, and look up the word Bayley, you can find, depending on which county it is, as many as 2 pages of deeds that were transferred to and from Bayley in this period as he slowly created these separate corporations. Given some of the difficulties that the Catholic Church has experienced in New Jersey in more recent years, particularly the bankruptcy of the Diocese of Camden, all 5 bishops of the state, as well as all 5 diocesan attorneys of New Jersey, routinely offer prayers of thanksgiving that due to Bayley's foresight, all the parishes of New Jersey are each a separate corporation. You can't sue them all at the same time. In July 1872, Bayley was named to the premier American see as 8th Archbishop of Baltimore. It was a promotion and brought him to the diocese where Mother Seton had lived and worked and was buried, but it was not necessarily a happy move. He loved Newark. and he loved New Jersey. Although he tried to avoid any formal farewell, nonetheless, on September 29, 1872, some 15,000 people turned out for the blessing of the cornerstone of the new St. Michael's Church in downtown Jersey City, simply because it was Bayley's last function as Bishop of Newark. By 1877, Bayley was experiencing declining health and took a trip to Europe, which he hoped would be restorative. On his way home, Bayley got as far as Newark in August of 1877, and he could go no farther. Without ever reaching Baltimore, Bayley died in peace on October 3rd, 1877, in his old rooms at the Cathedral Rectory in Newark. In the months before his promotion to Baltimore, Bayley engineered what was ultimately his last legacy to the church in New Jersey. One of Bayley's ongoing, but for a variety of reasons, slow-burning projects was a new cathedral for Newark. St. Patrick's had never been built to be a cathedral, and while beloved, its inadequacies became more and more apparent as the diocese grew. Bayley had previously purchased property for a new cathedral, first in 1859 on High Street, and then 8 years later in 1867 in the newly developing South Park neighborhood on Thomas Street, the present site of St. Columba's Church in downtown Newark. But somewhat uncharacteristically, something always prevented Bayley from moving forward with this project. But then in 1871, months before he left Newark, he sold the South Park property for a financial killing, 3 times what he had paid for it, and then had enough money to obtain the site that he really wanted, the highest point in the city of Newark, the present site of the Cathedral Basilica of the Sacred Heart. In the ensuing 150 years, each of Bayley's 9 successors would have the opportunity to contribute to that magnificent structure. But as with so much else in Catholic New Jersey, Archbishop James Roosevelt Bayley was the beginning. He selected and obtained the site for the foundation of Catholic New Jersey's Mother Church. So, thanks be to God, 180 years ago, after Bayley's coming into communion with our Catholic Church, his gracious but very effective legacy continues to impact every single one of us who sit here this afternoon. Thank you all for listening, and I hope you enjoy Bayley's. Please take tomorrow off in celebration of Bayley's 180th anniversary. You're welcome.
Oh my goodness.
I know you have thousands of questions, so please feel free.
Oh, I'm sure they should have questions, right? So what did Msgr say? Where should you guys go? You know, the beginning. Where is that?
Rome.
Yes, Rome, yes. They didn't come with you. Where?
Madison, yeah. Literally, if you know where the Jets practice bubble is and come out onto the main road and just go up a couple hundred feet on the left, you'll see a very graceful classical building, and that is the original Seton Hall.
I learned a lot.
So Madison, if you talk to real historians of Seton Hall, you know, there are 3 elements of Seton Hall: the prep, the university, and the seminary. And at one time, they were all joined together. You know, as late as the 1920s, the college and the prep shared a yearbook. And they were all on campus here at the same time. And at one point, for a brief period, there was also a grammar school over in Bailey Hall. So if you were, you know, if you can imagine what it was like to be a student, say in the late 19 teens, you could walk onto campus here for first grade and just stay here until the fourth year of graduate theology study and never leave campus. You know, even worse than Montclair State. But yeah, so the three of them, as late as 1970, the president of the university was still technically the president of the prep school as well. But if you talk to real historians of Seton Hall, they argue over which of the three elements was present at Madison. You know, they say certainly the prep school was there, although it wasn't called that. But if you look at the courses that were offered, that obviously it was at least the prep school was there. It's interesting because the property today is in Florham Park, actually, and Florham Park is the biggest contributing factor of students to Seton Hall Prep, even though most of them don't know it started in their town. But so, yeah, it's all the Madison property. When Bayley bought the property here and moved the college down here, he sold the property to the nuns, to the Sisters of Charity of St. Elizabeth. And the property then became their mother house. So basically, if you go up to St. E's today and look at that vast piece of property that they have, much bigger than what we have here, not counting all the property they sold across the street. That's where it is. So in the original building itself, I think they have one or two nuns that live in the building and a couple of offices and maybe occasionally a meeting or something when they want to dazzle people with their age, you know, they have meetings in the old building just to. If you look across the street from the old building, there is what is now called the Park Avenue Club, an eating club. And that building is originally the barn for Seton Hall. This is the barn that provided milk for the nuns and for the whole operation. So, but yeah, the building has been very well maintained, and it sits right on Madison Avenue. I have caused several accidents trying to point it out to people in traffic going up Park Avenue, and you know, yeah, you can see it very clearly. And it was already a school when Bayley bought it in 1856. So this is an old, they think the building goes back to 1790. Pardon? I think the nuns, knowing the nuns as I do, I'm sure that they have very clear deeds that we sold it to them.
What's the oldest building here? Stafford Hall before President's Hall? Is that correct?
Stafford Hall. Stafford Hall doesn't exist anymore.
Oh, no, they rebuilt.
I know. I would say it's probably a toss-up between President's Hall and the chapel. There was an older building that burned down, and then Seton Hall, President's Hall was built on it, and I think probably President's Hall is probably the oldest, then the chapel. Alumni Hall is, if you want a real piece of Seton Hall history, if you want to really think, especially given the last 2 months, if you really want to think of how far Seton Hall has come, go into the chapel of the seminary in what is Alumni Hall and just sit there for a moment and look around carefully. You could pray as well, but you know, just take a good gander around, and that is the original Seton Hall basketball court. So if you can think of the if you can think of the NCAA tournament of 2 months ago and Seton Hall's participation, and just go up into the chapel and look at how small a room it is and realize this is where it started.
It starts from a chapel, right?
If you ever meet Monsignor Liddy, his uncle played basketball in that room.
Wow. Other questions, people? This is fascinating, right? Just going back in history, exploring our roots, right? Why are we here today in this wonderful university of ours? Why are we celebrating Pedersheim exposition and also Bishop Bayley's legacy? Other questions? Something that you really didn't know? Yes. You did the microphone? No? Okay.
What were the five
The 5 major factors? Well, I would list, first of all, the sense of interest in Catholicism that was going on in the Episcopal world at the time. Secondly, his family. Thirdly, his own reading of the fathers of the church. The fathers of the church are very dangerous to read, because if you really read them with an open mind, Catholicism becomes almost obvious, and then his trip to Rome, to this day, he spent, it wasn't just a trip to Rome. It wasn't like what we do today, you do 9 days in Rome. He spent like 14 months in Europe on his grandfather's bill. The grandfather hoping that all this money would keep him from becoming Catholic. Meanwhile, he's in Rome, kissing up to cardinals and priests and getting himself baptized, and the grandfather's still shelling this out back in New York, The Roman trip was the final straw, really. And then the other thing were, after he became Episcopal priest, he meets up with Catholic clergy for the first time in the New York neighborhood. And that was really the first time he ever got to really talk to Catholic priests. And they settled many of his doubts, I think. McCluskey in particular, Bayley did not jump easily. He mentally jumped, but he had trouble bringing himself to go against his, like anybody, going against his grandfather, going against his family, all of his background and training. It was painful for him. It would be an MTV movie today. He was like paralyzed for this thing. And McCluskey really was the one who helped talk him over the river and helped him to see the possibilities that were present.
I don't have a question, but I have a comment. I'm one of the professors that brought the class to this lecture.
Good.
And I'm a Roman, so my accent reveals me, and I definitely had a
You don't
chuckle.
have to be beguiled by Rome. It's built in.
I am definitely reminded of Romanita. I'm definitely aware of that dimension. But the reason I wanted to take the word is to explain to you why I decided to bring the class, and also to the class in a way, why I decided to do this as our, this is the last class we have. We only have one more week and then it's over, right?
And you didn't
But
want to
today's
prepare a
class-
class and you brought them to me.
Today's class for us is going to be, today's class for us is on ecological conversion on Pope Francis Laudato Si, right? And ecological conversion is a very interesting juxtaposition of words that are very new and very old. Ecology is a recent human development. Conversion is a very old one, right? So putting them together, Pope Francis did something very interesting. He brought something very, very, very old into something very, very, very new. And I felt that that was a good way for us to encounter the purpose of the university, especially for a course like Core 2101 that is exposing us to texts that are very old, right? But there is a dimension also that I feel is very important, is that the Spirit is still speaking.
Yeah.
It's not just that Bayley had a conversion because he wanted to be converted. I'm very delighted that you actually described the conversion so precisely
It was
as
painful.
going silently and listening to what the Spirit was telling him. Because my invitation to the class is to do the same, to take yourself seriously and to think that the Spirit is actually speaking to you, through you, the same way he was speaking to Bayley. The Spirit is using all of us, and in many ways is using the entire university to say something that the world as a whole really needs to hear. And I really feel that I perceived a couple of chuckles when you were speaking. I felt the same, because stories of people that took the Spirit seriously are always good stories. Very, very good stories. So thank you again.
As I was walking over here to give this presentation
you,
this
Andrea.
afternoon, I was walking from the parking garage over to the library, and I just about got to the arcade, onto the library. And behind me, somebody said, "Excuse me, are you a priest?" And I turned around and I thought to myself, who else wears this? But I said, yes. And he said, and it was a student, a young student from the university. He says, "Can you hear my confession if we walk along under the colonnade?" And I thought to myself, Bailey's spirit is still alive in the student body today. The spirit is still moving, even here on this piece of property, in this university, in this context. So, yeah. And
Absolutely.
I think to answer your question back there, and to add to it, part of what the Catholic clergy in New York showed to Bayley was the practical part of being a Catholic. He had this very high theological appreciation that Catholicism must be right. But when he got introduced to the Catholic Charities outreach of the clergy in Manhattan, once he was there himself, this helped him to see the modern and very old application of Catholicism.
Absolutely, absolutely. Because just to Andrea's point, when we speak of conversion, conversion sometimes has rather negative connotation, right? So it's not all positive in English, but also in other languages. But when you look at life is a conversion. It's a big conversion, right? We all convert to our better self, becoming better, right? And that is the power of the Spirit. So listen to that Spirit to become better, a better you, right? And that's a way of looking at conversion, not with that negative connotation rather of conversion, because that is life, right? Conversion and transformation to become better. Okay, then other questions for Monsignor? No? Anyway, thank you so much, Monsignor, and
Thank you.
for this wonderful,
delightful.
lecture. And go Pirates, in the spirit of Archbishop Bayley.